August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Through binoculars mounted on the observation post atop Hill 281, Japanese Colonel Kiyono Ichiki watched with barely concealed contempt as American landing craft disgorged their cargo onto the beaches at Lunga Point. The intelligence reports from Tokyo had been unambiguous. Approximately 10,000 American troops, recently arrived from the soft comfort of peacetime garrisons, would attempt to seize the partially constructed airfield. Ichiki, veteran of campaigns in China, where Japanese forces had shattered numerically superior Chinese armies, permitted himself a thin smile. His 9 Muevasindin men, elite soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment, originally slated for the Midway operation, would be more than sufficient. The Americans possessed numbers, yes, but numbers meant nothing against warriors trained in the code of Bushido, soldiers who had spent years perfecting the art of night infiltration and close combat. What Colonel Ichiki could not see through his field glasses, what no amount of Japanese intelligence gathering had uncovered, was the invisible weapon the Americans brought ashore that August morning. It wasn't carried in the hands of individual Marines. It couldn't be photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. It existed not in steel or explosives, but in meticulously crafted doctrine, relentlessly practiced procedures, and revolutionary equipment integration that had taken 2 decades to perfect. Within 6 days, Ichiki's entire force would be annihilated at the Tenaru River. But the catastrophe at Guadalcanal represented merely the first manifestation of a pattern that would repeat across every coral atoll and volcanic island, from the Solomons to Okinawa. The Japanese had fundamentally misunderstood not just American capabilities, but the entire nature of amphibious warfare as the Marines had reimagined it. The story begins not in 1942, but in 1921, in a quiet office at Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. There, a brilliant but troubled officer named Lieutenant Colonel Earl Hancock, Pete Ellis, was completing a document that would prove more prophetic than any intelligence estimate in military history. Operation Plan 712, titled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia, outlined with uncanny precision the war that would unfold more than 2 decades later. Ellis, who had served as an intelligence officer and operations planner, recognized what few others in the American military establishment had grasped. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 had forbidden fortification of Pacific possessions, but Japan had gained control of Germany's former Mandate Islands, the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas, creating a defensive barrier across the Central Pacific. If war came with Japan, the United States Navy would need advanced bases to project power westward toward the Philippines and the home islands. Creating those bases would require seizing fortified islands from a determined enemy, and Operation Conventional Military Wisdom deemed impossible after the Gallipoli disaster of 1915. Ellis's 30,000-word document predicted the island-hopping campaign with remarkable accuracy, specifying which island groups would need to be captured and in what sequence. More critically, he outlined the doctrine, equipment, training, and logistics required for successful amphibious assault against defended positions. Commandant General John Lejeune approved Ellis's plan on July 23, 1921, making it the cornerstone of Marine Corps strategic planning for the Pacific. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, while Japan built its military power in Asia and the Pacific, the Marine Corps devoted itself to solving the amphibious assault problem. The effort was painstaking and often frustrating. Annual fleet landing exercises, conducted alternately in the Caribbean and Pacific, tested new concepts and equipment. Marine Corps schools at Quantico became laboratories for amphibious doctrine development. Officers and enlisted men studied every aspect of ship-to-shore movement, from the design of landing craft to the coordination of naval gunfire with infantry assault. The work culminated in 1934 with publication of the Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, a comprehensive guide that addressed command relationships, naval gunfire support, air support, beachhead logistics, and communications. The Navy adopted it as Fleet Training Publication 167 in 1938. Even the Army, initially skeptical of amphibious operations, incorporated the Marine Corps doctrine into Field Manual 31-5. The Japanese military, despite its intelligence apparatus throughout the Pacific, fundamentally failed to appreciate the scope and sophistication of American amphibious preparations. Japanese naval officers had observed some U.S. fleet exercises, but these were dismissed as unrealistic peacetime maneuvers. When American forces landed at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, Japanese commanders at Rabaul didn't even know where Guadalcanal was located. Army staff officers had to consult maps to find the island that the Navy had selected as a seaplane base. This ignorance extended to understanding American capabilities. Japanese intelligence estimates, based on cultural assumptions about Western softness and individualism, concluded that American troops would break under pressure, that they lacked the spiritual strength for sustained combat, that their reliance on material comfort made them vulnerable to the hardships of jungle warfare. These assessments proved catastrophically wrong. The first Japanese counterattack at Guadalcanal embodied this underestimation. Colonel Ichiki's orders reflected confidence that his 900 men could overwhelm the Marine beachhead through aggressive night attack. Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit over materiel, believing that determined infantry could overcome numerical disadvantage through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill developed in years of combat in China. What Ichiki encountered on the night of August 20th, 1942, at the Tinnaru River shattered every assumption. His troops waded into the river, expecting to catch sleeping Americans unprepared for night combat. Instead, they walked into a killing zone where Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion waited in prepared positions. Pre-registered artillery coordinates allowed American guns to deliver devastating fire within seconds. Interlocking fields of machine gun fire, coordinated through training that had begun years before Pearl Harbor, slaughtered the Japanese infantry before they reached Marine lines. The battle lasted 20 minutes. Over 700 Japanese soldiers died. Marine casualties numbered 35. Ichiki, witnessing the destruction of his command, committed suicide. Survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened. The Americans were supposed to fear darkness, yet they fought at night with coordination that suggested supernatural awareness. They weren't supposed to hold positions against determined assault, yet they had annihilated elite troops without retreating a meter. Japanese intelligence reports following Guadalcanal noted the unexpected American capabilities, but failed to understand their source. Analysts attributed Marine performance to lucky circumstances or exceptional individual units, rather than recognizing systematic doctrinal advantages. This failure to learn would cost Japan dearly as the war progressed. The amphibious assault problem had three fundamental components that Ellis and his successors addressed. First, getting men and equipment from ships to shore across defended beaches under fire. Second, coordinating multiple supporting arms, naval gunfire, air support, and artillery to suppress defenders during and after landing. Third, rapidly building combat power ashore faster than defenders could reinforce and counterattack. The Marines solved the first problem through specialized landing craft development. The critical breakthrough came from observing Japanese amphibious operations in China. Marine Lieutenant Victor Krulak photographed Japanese forces using boats with bow ramps that allowed rapid troop discharge directly onto beaches. In 1941, Krulak met with Andrew Higgins, a New Orleans boat builder who had designed shallow draft vessels for Louisiana swamps. Using Krulak's photographs and sketches, Higgins modified his Eureka boat design, adding a steel bow ramp that could drop to form a full-width exit. By December 1941, the first landing craft, vehicle personnel prototypes, the LCVP or Higgins boat, were complete. The Higgins boat revolutionized amphibious assault. Constructed primarily of plywood with steel armor plate on the bow and sides, it was inexpensive and simple to manufacture. Its shallow draft, just 2 feet forward and 3 feet aft, allowed it to run directly onto beaches. The semi-tunnel hull protected the propeller from sand and debris. Most critically, the bow ramp allowed 36 fully equipped troops to disembark in seconds, protected by the boat's sides until the moment they charged ashore. Production of Higgins boats exceeded 20,000 units during the war. General Eisenhower later stated that, without the LCVP, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Yet the Higgins boat had a fatal limitation. It couldn't cross coral reefs that surrounded most Pacific islands. The solution came from another civilian innovation: Donald Roebling, heir to a New York industrial fortune, had designed an amphibious rescue vehicle for Florida's Everglades. Published in Life magazine in 1937, photographs of Roebling's alligator caught the attention of marine planners. The tracked vehicle could navigate water and land, using cleats that gripped soft terrain while serving as paddles for propulsion. The Marines convinced Roebling to adapt his design for military use. By July 1941, the Food Machinery Company produced the first landing vehicle, tracked LVT-1, later called Amtrak. The vehicle could carry 18 troops or 4,500 pounds of cargo across water and continue inland. At Guadalcanal in late 1942, LVTs proved their worth in logistics, moving supplies from ships to shore and returning with wounded Marines. Japanese forces observed these operations, but failed to appreciate their significance. They noted unusual American vehicles without understanding how LVTs would transform amphibious assault. The revelation came at Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, where coral reefs extending hundreds of yards offshore made conventional landing craft useless. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding Tarawa's 4,800-man garrison, had fortified Betio Island with interlocking bunkers, pillboxes, and coastal artillery. He famously declared that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The island's coral reef seemed to guarantee his boast. Intelligence indicated that tides would allow Higgins boats to cross the reef. But when the 2nd Marine Division launched its assault on November 20, 1943, an unexpected Niue tide stranded hundreds of landing craft. 75 LVT-1s and 50 LVT-2s became the only vehicles capable of breaching the reef. Under withering fire, these amphibious tractors carried Marines across hundreds of yards of coral and shallow water directly to the beach. Of 125 LVTs committed, only 35 remained operational by day's end. But they proved Colonel David Shoup's assessment that, without LVTs, there is no operation. Marines arriving in Higgins boats faced nightmare conditions. Unable to cross the reef, they had to wade through chest-deep water for up to 900 yards while Japanese machine guns raked their ranks. Casualties were horrific. Many who reached shore alive had lost rifles and equipment in the water. The battle's brutality shocked both sides. In 76 hours of fighting, 1,027 Marines died and 2,292 were wounded. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison perished. Japanese defenders witnessed American capabilities that their training and doctrine couldn't explain. Despite murderous fire that should have stopped any assault, Marines continued advancing. When first wave units were decimated, second and third waves came behind them. Bunkers that withstood naval bombardment fell to demolition teams who crawled forward under fire, died, and were replaced by other Marines who completed the mission. The second component of amphibious doctrine, supporting fire's coordination, evolved through painful experience. At Guadalcanal, naval gunfire support had been inadequate and poorly coordinated with ground operations. Naval officers, trained for ship-to-ship combat, understood little about supporting troops ashore. The prolonged fighting in the Solomons provided hard lessons. By 1943, the Marines had developed joint assault signal companies, specialized units that coordinated naval gunfire, air support, and artillery. JASCOs integrated representatives from Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces, establishing common communication procedures and fire support coordination measures. Shore fire control parties embedded with frontline infantry could call in naval gunfire within minutes, using radio equipment that allowed direct communication with offshore ships. Forward air controllers directed close air support strikes, sometimes bringing aircraft within hundreds of yards of friendly positions. The sophistication of American fire support coordination astonished Japanese defenders who survived to be captured. One interrogation report from Saipan in June 1944 described the Japanese perspective. A lieutenant who had commanded a defensive position noted that when Marines encountered resistance, they immediately called in overwhelming firepower. Within minutes, naval guns delivered hundreds of shells. Aircraft appeared overhead, dropping bombs and napalm. Tank-mounted flamethrowers burned out bunkers. The methodical destruction continued until resistance ceased. Then infantry advanced to secure the position. This wasn't the desperate, spirit-driven combat Japanese doctrine anticipated. It was industrial warfare applied with relentless efficiency. The Americans didn't try to overcome positions through courage or tactical brilliance. They used overwhelming material resources, coordinated through communication systems Japanese forces lacked, to methodically annihilate any resistance. The third component, logistics, represented perhaps the greatest disparity between American and Japanese capabilities. The Marines had developed combat loading techniques that ensured supplies were stowed on transport ships in the sequence they would be needed ashore. Pioneer battalions, specially trained for beach operations, moved supplies inland as fast as landing craft delivered them. American logistics included portable water purification equipment, mobile kitchens preparing hot meals, medical facilities with surgical capability, ammunition dumps that kept frontline units supplied indefinitely, and replacement systems that could rebuild devastated units within days. Japanese defenders, watching from their positions, saw Marines living better in combat than Japanese troops did in garrison. The strategic impact was cumulative and devastating. Japanese commanders planning defensive operations faced mathematical impossibility. They could inflict casualties through determined resistance, but Americans replaced losses faster than Japan could resupply isolated garrisons. Every major battle followed the same pattern. Heavy initial casualties, fierce fighting for days or weeks, eventual American victory through attrition that Japan couldn't sustain. By 1944, Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved to acknowledge reality. Documents captured on Tinian included guidance for garrison commanders that was startlingly frank. When defending against Marine assault, expect to hold positions temporarily at best. The objective isn't to stop Americans, but to delay them sufficiently for other strategic purposes. Each day of resistance is valuable. Each Marine casualty is valuable. But understand that the position will fall. Accept that you will likely die in the defense. This grim calculus defined Japanese strategy for the war's final year. At Peleliu in September 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa constructed elaborate cave defenses designed not to prevent American victory, but to maximize casualties. His forces inflicted over 10,000 American casualties in 2 months of fighting. But Nakagawa's entire garrison perished, and the island fell to overwhelming American material superiority. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, preparing Iwo Jima's defenses in early 1945, understood the futility perfectly. In letters to his wife, he acknowledged that defeating the Marines was impossible. The mission was extracting such terrible cost that American planners might reconsider invading the home islands. Kuribayashi banned the wasteful banzai charges that had squandered Japanese lives in earlier battles. He created defense in depth, positioning artillery for devastating fire on landing beaches, building 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting 1,500 cave positions. When 3 Marine divisions, 70,000 men, landed on February 19, 1945, Kuribayashi's defenses worked as designed. Marines suffered 26,000 casualties in 36 days of fighting, nearly 40% of forces committed. But all 21,000 Japanese defenders died except 1,016 captured, most unconscious or too wounded to resist. The Marines paid the price Kuribayashi demanded and took every objective. The systematic nature of Marine operations, refined through 3 years of combat, made defeat inevitable regardless of Japanese determination. At the tactical level, small unit leadership allowed Marines to adapt faster than Japanese forces could react. Sergeants made decisions Japanese doctrine reserved for captains. Corporals led assaults requiring lieutenant authority in imperial forces. When bunkers stopped advances, sergeants immediately redirected attacks through different approaches while calling supporting fire, all without waiting for orders from above. At the operational level, the integration of air, naval, and ground power created capabilities Japanese forces couldn't match. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, American commanders coordinated the largest concentration of supporting fires in the Pacific War. Naval gunfire delivered 14,250 tons of munitions. Aircraft flew thousands of sorties. Artillery units fired continuously. JASCOs managed this complexity, ensuring responsive fires that suppressed Japanese positions while Marines advanced. Perhaps most critically, American Amphibious doctrine incorporated systematic learning. After-action reports from each operation identified problems and generated solutions. The disaster at Tarawa, where inadequate LVT numbers forced troops to wade ashore under fire, led to expanded amphibious tractor battalions for every division. By Iwo Jima, specialized armored LVTA, 4s mounting 75mm howitzers provided fire support during landing. Flamethrower-equipped LVTs burned out bunkers. The number of LVTs per battalion increased from 100 to 300. Japanese forces adapted as well, but their adaptations reflected desperation rather than doctrinal evolution. Unable to stop American landings at the water's edge, they shifted to defense in depth. Unable to match American firepower, they emphasized camouflage and concealment. Unable to resupply or reinforce, they stockpiled ammunition and supplies in cave positions. These were tactical adjustments to mitigate American advantages rather than doctrinal innovations that could reverse the strategic equation. The fundamental Japanese error was conceptual rather than tactical. From the war's beginning, Japanese commanders viewed combat through the lens of spirit versus materiel, believing that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This philosophical framework prevented them from understanding that American Amphibious doctrine represented not just more resources, but a different approach to warfare. The Marines weren't simply throwing material at problems. They had created an integrated system where doctrine, training, equipment, and logistics worked synergistically. Landing craft designers had solved ship-to-shore movement. Communication specialists had created networks allowing unprecedented coordination. Logistics officers had devised supply systems that sustained operations indefinitely. Medical personnel had developed casualty evacuation procedures that saved lives at unprecedented rates. Each element reinforced others. Reliable landing craft allowed predictable build-up schedules. Effective communications enabled coordinated fires that suppressed defenses. Efficient logistics sustained operations without pause. Medical evacuation that saved wounded Marines meant experienced combat veterans returned to duty. The system produced compound advantages that Japanese spirit and tactical skill couldn't overcome. In post-war interrogations, surviving Japanese officers acknowledged this reality with remarkable candor. General Kuribayashi's final message from Iwo Jima, transmitted on March 21, 1945, 5 days before the island fell, summarized what Japan's best commanders had learned. The Marines are the finest soldiers I have encountered. Their training is superior. Their equipment is overwhelming. Their courage equals ours. Their numbers are endless. Japan cannot defeat such an enemy. We can only die fighting them and hope that our sacrifice buys time for peace negotiations that preserve something of our nation. This assessment, from one of Japan's most capable defensive commanders, captured the war's essential truth. American Amphibious doctrine hadn't just solved technical problems of landing troops on hostile shores. It had created a comprehensive system that integrated every aspect of warfare, from strategic planning to tactical execution, from equipment design to personnel training, from logistics to medical care. The Japanese had underestimated not individual components, but the totality. They saw Higgins boats without understanding the logistics that kept them supplied. They faced naval gunfire without recognizing the communication systems that made it responsive. They encountered Marines who wouldn't retreat without comprehending the replacement systems that made casualties sustainable. They witnessed overwhelming material superiority without understanding the doctrine that transformed resources into combat power. The ultimate irony was that Pete Ellis, the brilliant but troubled officer who had predicted the Pacific War in 1921, never saw his vision realized. In 1923, while on a mysterious reconnaissance mission to the Japanese Mandate Islands, Ellis died on Palau under circumstances that remain unclear. His alcoholism had destroyed his health, and he succumbed to nephritis at age 42. The Japanese authorities who handled his death likely never understood that the sick American who died in their territory had written the blueprint for their destruction 20 years before the war began. Ellis's legacy lived through the Marines who fought the battles he had envisioned. The doctrine he helped create, refined by thousands of officers and enlisted men through decades of study and practice, proved decisive. The specialized equipment he had called for transformed amphibious assault from an impossible mission into a repeatable operation. The training he had advocated created warriors who could execute complex combined arms operations under the most difficult conditions imaginable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, American amphibious capability had reached a level no other nation could match. The British, despite their Royal Marine tradition, acknowledged American superiority. The Soviets, planning operations against Japanese-held islands, requested American assistance. Future amphibious operations, from Incheon in 1950 to modern Marine Expeditionary Unit operations, would be based on doctrine developed in the crucible of the Pacific War. The Japanese commanders who had laughed at American capabilities in 1942 were dead or prisoners by 1945. Those who survived to interrogation consistently told the same story. They had underestimated American amphibious warfare capability because they had looked for spirit and tactical brilliance, the qualities Japanese doctrine valued. They had failed to see that the Americans had created something different, a systematic, scientific approach to warfare that used doctrine, training, equipment, and logistics to achieve objectives regardless of cost. In the end, the invisible weapon that Marines brought ashore at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, proved more decisive than any gun or bomb. It was 2 decades of doctrinal development, countless hours of training, specialized equipment designed for specific missions, and logistics systems that sustained operations indefinitely. It was the transformation of amphibious assault from an impossible dream into America's most potent offensive weapon. It was the systematic application of industrial power to warfare, coordinated through doctrine, that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese commanders had looked at American Marines and seen soft soldiers from a comfortable democracy. What they should have seen were warriors trained to doctrinal standards that made individual courage one component in an integrated system of overwhelming combat power. By the time they understood this truth, it was too late. The war was already lost. The statistics tell the final story. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, Marines conducted dozens of major amphibious operations, seized hundreds of islands, and never failed to take an objective once committed. The cost was terrible: 19,133 Marines killed in action, 67,207 wounded, but Japanese casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Every major island garrison was destroyed. The mathematical equation Ellis had predicted in 1921 played out exactly as he had foreseen. If you found this deep dive into military history fascinating, give us a like and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. Drop a comment below with which Pacific battle you'd like us to cover next. The history of how America won the Pacific War is full of incredible stories that most people have never heard. Don't miss the next one.